After 12 days of hostilities, Israel and Iran reportedly agreed to a ceasefire yesterday. Let's take a look on what this all means and how this affects our country. Good morning. I'm Attorney Karen Jimeno, and we're taking you at the forefront. Following a volatile exchange of missile strikes, a fragile truce between Iran and Israel was reached yesterday, offering a brief respite from further escalation. As tensions ease, questions now turn to the broader impact of the crisis, not just on regional stability and global markets, but also on the Philippines, from potential fuel price shocks to risks facing overseas Filipino workers. How will this de-escalation shape the country's economic outlook and foreign policy stance in the months ahead? With us this morning is a professor in the University of the Philippines Political Science Department who is a published author on international relations and international security, Herman Joseph Kraft. Good morning, Professor Herman.
Hi, good morning, Karen.
Let's start first. Perhaps you can give us a history of how this conflict between Israel and Iran started.
Oh no, that's going to take hours
yes,
actually.
so in as short as you can.
Well, of course, it's to a certain extent it's actually related to the crisis in Gaza right now, right? So that history goes back quite some time. It goes back to as far back in 1947 when AUN decision for a two-state solution between the Jews and the Palestinian Arabs, was reached, But during that time, the region was actually divided between those who supported the Jews and then those who actually supported the Arabs in Palestine. So what is interesting here is that if you take a look at the situation now and go back historically speaking, there was a time when Iran and Israel actually had very good relations prior to the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979. In fact, there was some security ties between Iran and under the Shah of Iran and Israel. But because the Islamic Revolution actually tilted the politics of Iran towards a much more Islamic bent, then it was actually important for them to support the Arab Palestinians in their resistance, if you will, against Israel. So that's the reason why you have a number of things related to it in terms of Iran's support for groups like Hamas or Hezbollah, for instance. But there's also another aspect to it. This is really a very complicated picture if you think about it.
It sounds like, and from being friends back in the 70s and then now this very pronounced conflict.
But it's not just Israel and Iran. There's also a geopolitical context within which Iran is seeking to become the influential power in the region. And in that context, it's not Israel that is actually at loggerheads with. It's actually Saudi Arabia. So you have this very complicated picture where Iran is actually engaged in some form of power play, if you will, that involves its relations with Saudi Arabia. But at the same time, Iran is now the dominant player as far as the opposition to Israel's position in Palestine is actually concerned.
Okay, and there have been mentions of proxy conflicts.
Right. Yeah.
What are these proxy conflicts?
Proxy conflicts actually involve groups that Iran actually supports. So Iran doesn't actually directly involve itself in conflicts with Israel, or with anybody that it's actually engaged in some form of competition with, right? So, for instance, the Houthis in Yemen is notably supported by Iran, and their opposition is actually to the influence of Saudi Arabia, right? When it comes to Israel, though, No, there are multiple groups that are supported by Iran. That includes, like I said earlier on, no, Hezbollah is the most influential group, no, but Hamas as well, right? So to that extent, Iran has been involved in these conflicts, no, but not directly, but through groups that it actually supports.
So would you say that this has been brewing for a long time, and Israel's attack on Iran was because of the proxy conflicts? Israel knowing that Iran was somehow involved, but even if they're not directly in conflict with any of those groups?
The analysis that most observers have actually come up with, no, is that to a large extent, these actually involves Prime Minister Netanyahu personally, because it's always been his advocacy that Iran should never have nuclear weapons, right?
Yeah.
So that's the first point there. The second point is that because of the attack by Hamas on Israel in October 7th last year, there was this sense that, they've been able to degrade all of these proxy groups that Iran has been able to use in order to push its influence in the region, right? So in degrading them, in making them less capable of operations, right? There's the sense that now Israel is now in a better position to actually engage with what it perceives to be, or what it argues, no, is the one who's actually behind all of these operations, no, or significantly behind against all these operations against Israel. That's Iran, right? And that's why you had those missile attacks. But the interesting thing there is that the argument has always been about the nuclear capability of Iran. The idea that it's developing nuclear weapons, or at least uranium enhancement to the degree that it can develop nuclear weapons, which is something that would be an existential threat to Israel. Or at least that's the argument that's actually being made. That's a different thing altogether from, does Iran really have that capability, right? At least from an Israeli standpoint, no, that's the primary threat right now. And so the idea was to make sure that Iran doesn't develop those capabilities, make sure that it doesn't have nuclear weapons that can actually threaten Israel. The interesting thing here is that the kinds of facilities that Iran has actually been using in order to develop those kinds of capabilities, no? Whether it's come to the point where one argument has been made that Iran already has enough uranium that would allow it to develop bombs, no, or nuclear missiles, no, or warheads with nuclear capability, or its missiles, no, within days, right? And others have said, no, we're not there yet. But the interesting point there is that those facilities are hardened, as they say, right? It's actually
hardened.
Hardened. It's placed in infrastructure, no, that cannot be destroyed so easily from any attacks on the surface, right? So Israeli missile attacks against Iran, no, can't reach those particular facilities. They can hit some facilities, which they did,
Yeah.
right? But certain facilities they cannot. So
What
that's
about
why
the U.S.
Well,
when
that's the
when they
reason why.
launched? So that's another reason
Yeah,
why
that's
U.S. had to.
had to come in.
Yeah.
As Donald Trump has been saying, and many analysts have been saying, no, only the United States has the capability, the kinds of assets, no, that would allow that could actually penetrate those kinds of hardened targets, and therefore really destroy those kinds of facilities, right?
So, in your opinion, there is basis for, just yesterday, United States Vice President J.D. Vance said that they have destroyed the
Yeah.
capability of Iran for any nuclear building. Is that a fair statement? Is that accurate?
It's interesting because just early this morning, right, reports coming from supposedly from the Defense Intelligence Agency of the United States was saying that no, they weren't able to actually do that. There was some damage that actually took place, no, but the idea that the complete destruction of those facilities have been ensured by the bombing attack by the United States, no, is something that's now being challenged by reports, initial reports, coming from their own defense intelligence agency. So we're not yet sure, really, at this point in time, just how much damage was actually made, to Iran's capacity to develop a nuclear weapons capability.
Did Iran violate any international agreement by building up their nuclear capabilities? Are they part of any, like NATO, for example, or any other group that would prohibit them from?
There was an agreement internationally that prohibited Iran from doing that. This was during the time of President Obama. And part of, admittedly, I think Iran was stalling as far as some of the things that it promised, under that agreement. But there was supposed to be an international commission that would investigate, check on progress as far as the agreement was, or the terms of the agreement was concerned. But when Donald Trump came to power in this first term, he withdrew the United States from that. And basically, Iran said, well, without the United States, there's no point, right? And so the signaling was that Iran was going to proceed with its own nuclear weapons development. And that's the thing that now, under Trump 2.0, the United States is actually saying, has to be stopped. In terms of violation, I think there was a report that came out of the IAEA, that basically said that Iran was stalling. It wasn't too forthcoming as far as inspections were actually concerned, and therefore Iran could do more as far as what it promised to do, as far as the inspections, and it's what it promises as far as what it will develop,
Yes.
So there's that report, right? Yeah. But it did not say, or the report was not saying that there was no goodwill, that Iran wasn't really doing what it needed to do. No, that it was simply that Iran was stalling, right? And I think this was something, the Israeli position has always been, Iran should never be allowed to, develop nuclear capability, even peaceful ones, because that would allow them access to uranium products, that can be enhanced, to weapons grade level, right? Yes. So those are the things that's problematic as far as anybody who's trying to look at whether Iran is really doing something wrong.
Yeah.
Right?
Was it clear that the nuclear capabilities they were developing were meant for aggression, not for example, nuclear power?
I think that's the problem with what you might refer to as dual purpose capabilities, right? So you might be developing capabilities that are for civilian purposes, for peaceful purposes, for energy utilization in Iran. But it's easy to actually, well, not that easy, but there is the technology to shift that kind of development to one that would allow Iran to develop nuclear weapons. So that's the thing that Israel has always been warning everybody with, that Iran should not be. So even enhancement capability for peaceful purposes, Iran should never be allowed that.
Did Israel violate any international agreement or being United Nations, for example, any commitments there by unilaterally initiating an attack against Iran?
Remember, you might have been too young, but when George Bush Jr. was actually talking about a preemptive attack against Iraq, right? The justification of
the weapons of mass destruction. I was already,
and that was supposed to be a preemptive war, right? So in other words, the question was, is a preemptive war something that is arguably legal, right? Because it's an aggressive war. And the United Nations basically says, is all about preventing wars of aggression, right? So even if a country feels threatened by another country, right, it cannot preemptively attack, or at least there's a debate around that particular issue, right?
Yeah.
So this question about Israel, right, was it justified? Did it have the legal strictures that allowed it to legitimately claim that it could attack, or it had the basis for attacking Iran? Like I said, the issue there is that from an Israeli argument, right, this is an existential threat to Israel. So from that, on that basis, they did have the legitimate reasons now for attacking. But if we're talking about strictly looking at the United Nations, this was never something that any country could actually claim legally.
You're a published author in international relations, international security. Was this something that surprised you? Because the other geopolitical issues that are more evident for us, especially as Filipinos, would be the conflict in China and Taiwan, and people have been saying it's something that might be imminent, China suddenly taking over Taiwan. But this attack that started from, or as you said, aggression that started from Israel to Iran, was this something that you foresaw?
Not really, because I think the road towards that particular situation, right, goes back at least in terms of proximate time to the attack of Hamas against Israel,
Which happened in October
7
yes.
Last year. So basically, you're talking about the argument that Iran is the one that's manipulating all of these things. So that attack was something that Iran had a hand in somehow, right? Whether that's right or wrong, or at least true. No, the question there is, okay, with that attack, no, could we have predicted that, it would have gone all the way to Israel actually responding against Iran directly,
Yeah.
right? So it wasn't that easy. Like I said, the situation, the geopolitical situation in the Middle East is very, very complicated at this point.
Yeah, very complicated. And it kind of reminds me as well when we were talking about President George
Yeah.
W. Bush, when 9/11 happened.
Yeah.
It was after that that there was, again, a political, or what do you call it, aggression against Iraq. And some were tracing it supposedly to some involvement with the 9/11 attacks.
That's right.
So that, to a certain extent, reminds me of this. And what do you think would be the reaction of other allies? You mentioned Saudi Arabia as currently the dominant power, but it seems Saudi Arabia is allied with the United States. Iran, do they have powerful allies? Like, is Russia, China, are those countries allies of Iran?
Actually, Russia and China were the ones one amongst the first who actually came out with statements against, condemning the U.S. attack against Iran. The interesting thing is that I think Saudi Arabia and the other Arab countries were a little bit concerned about the degree to which the United States seemed to do this unilaterally, right? Meaning to say that the attack was something that concerned them because it was so easy. It seemed so easy for Donald Trump to actually make the decision, right? There was no direct aggression against U.S. or if you're talking about U.S. interests, then of course U.S. interests include Israel, right? But if you're talking about any direct aggression or actions undertaken by Iran against U.S. assets and interests, right? It's so hard to identify what it was, that prompted the United States or Donald Trump to actually make that decision to use those bunker penetrators, against Iran. aside from the fact that Netanyahu has been calling for the involvement of the United States in this to completely destroy Iran's nuclear capability.
What is the interest of the United States in Israel?
In Israel, it's a long-term. This is something that we use as well, right? The long-standing alliance with Israel. Israel is basically its foothold, if you will, of influence around the region, right? So at one level, we might actually say that Israel is the one that actually pushes American interests in the region. But it's a two-way street for them, right? Israeli interests in the region are also being assisted, if you will, by American influence and material capability.
That's true. And a lot of people also say that this whole conflict between Israel and Palestine has been long-standing because of the support that
The
Israel
United States has provided.
constantly gets from the United States. Yesterday, shortly after U.S. President Trump announced that there was a ceasefire between Iran and Israel, Iran launched missiles in a U.S. airbase in
Qatar. Yeah.
But after that, President Trump, instead of retaliation, went to X and said that he encouraged for Israel and Iran to proceed to peace and harmony. Why did the U.S. not retaliate? But before you answer that question, we'll have to take a short break. At the Forefront, we'll be right back. Welcome back at the Forefront. Professor Herman, yesterday, shortly after U.S. President Trump announced a ceasefire between Iran and Israel, Iran launched missiles at a U.S. airbase in Qatar. But instead of retaliating, President Trump announced or went on social media and posted that he encouraged for Iran and Israel to proceed to peace and harmony. Why did U.S. not retaliate?
Who knows what Donald Trump is actually thinking, right? But I think part of it has to do with, well, number one, if you think about it, it wasn't a massive attack, right? It was just a few missiles that were directed.
I think there were 14 missiles, according to a report.
So, and if to a large extent, the amount of damage that the base actually received wasn't that great, right? So
they were able to prevent it, right? Qatar also launched their own missiles
their
to
defense,
prevent.
air defense missiles, right? Be that as it may, right? It's still an attack, right? But I think at this point in time, and if you listen to what the talking heads in Washington are actually saying, right? The air attack against Iran by American bombers actually completely, I think the word that they use, obliterated, right? The nuclear weapons capability, or the capability to develop nuclear weapons by Iran. This is now being debated now because there are other, like I said, there are other reports saying otherwise. No? But if Trump believes that, right, then I think the logic behind it, or at least it goes to the logic that Iran has no choice now but to go to negotiations. And at this point in time, there's no need for the United States to do anything more, no? Because the response, Iran had to respond in some way, right? But that response was seen as, or could be seen as being, it's too weak to.
Well, that's actually what President Trump said. It was a weak response.
That's right. Yeah.
But is there really then a ceasefire that the world can rely on? Because again, shortly after this was announced by President Trump, Iran launched missiles directly attacking a U.S. air base in Qatar. Even if this was preempted by defense missiles, it looks like they were showing the world that we're not okay or we're not honoring that ceasefire.
Right. Yeah. It's to be clear about it. It is any ceasefire after this kind of exchange is going to be fragile, right? And I think there was a report of a few missiles again being launched against Tel Aviv. So we're not really too sure if there is a ceasefire in place, and so if that's the case, then what are these further attacks? What do these further attacks actually mean? But I think some reports that I've actually heard and read are saying that at the very least, for instance, Israel has used up quite a bit of its munitions for its air defense capability, which means that explains, or at least partially explains, why some of those latest attacks from Iran have actually been able to penetrate their air defense, right? So it hit Tel Aviv and some other targets in Israel. So which tells us that, okay, there might be an interest on the part of the Israeli government to try to de-escalate things, right, in this context.
And do you believe that's possible? Because Ayatollah Ali Khamenei also posted on social media that we will not submit to anyone's harassment. And along with that statement was an illustration of the American flag in burning and in tatters, with also a picture of a U.S. airbase that's in wreckage. So what kind of message is he sending? And I guess suppose people don't know him as much compared to how much we know President Trump's personality.
Right. Yeah. He has to say those things, right? This is also partly in order to be able to show his own people that they are responding, that this is not going to be allowed against Iran. The question is what's happening behind the scenes, so to speak, right? If there was talk of a ceasefire, and I think one of the things that's quite interesting is that if there were still some attacks, those attacks seem to be muted compared to what it was before. I mean, look at how massive the attacks were before, right? How many missiles were launched by Iran. Now you're talking about a few missiles actually being launched. So the question there is Israel actually going to respond even against those small attacks, right? Or relatively small attacks? Or is the signaling now, okay, yes, we're ready to ramp things down, right? Which means that, I guess to a certain extent, the assumption is that Netanyahu can now send the signal that, yeah, we've done what we set out to do, right? We've actually forced Iran to reduce its capabilities, that there has been a degradation of its capabilities to develop those nuclear weapons. Although, of course, some estimates that, we're talking about a few months, right?
A few months more.
A few months from now, Iran can go back to what it was doing before, right?
Okay.
So in other words, this ceasefire might hold for some time, but is this going to lead to long-standing peace? I'm not too sure if that's the case.
You're not too sure?
No.
Nako. And so we're in it for a long haul when it comes to, like, at least the uncertainties when it comes to fuel prices.
Oh, well, as far as the fuel prices are concerned, right, if that's what we're looking at, I think there's going to be some recovery, if you will, right? But meaning to say that the spike up now would actually lead to it going down a little bit more in the next few weeks, if you think about that. But if you're looking at or if the question is all about, can we see this leading to long-term peace, to something that ends the kind of uncertainty that we've been facing for decades now in the Middle East, I'm not confident about that.
You're not confident about that. Well, the Iran-Israel conflict is on top of the Russia-Ukraine conflict that has been dragging on for years already. So what would that do to the geopolitical landscape?
the major issue right now is you could say that there was some predictability, no, during the time of the Biden administration, because at least things were as we understood them, right? You know, U.S. allies, no, facing up to perceived long-standing enemies, right, or at least opponents. The politics of the foreign policies of the Trump administration is less predictable, right? It's more transactional. There seems to be a tendency to look at things in terms of key U.S. allies, no, on the forefront, no, who are actually pushing forward what the United States or what Donald Trump believes to be the interest of the U.S. So that's Israel, for instance, right? But with other allies, right, with its long-standing allies in Europe, for instance, the relationship is less clear, right? On one hand, you're not really too sure about the relationship between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, for instance, and therefore the relationship between the United States and Russia.
When you say not so sure, you mean that there might be at least better relations compared to Biden's administration?
Well, the clear thing is that while the Biden administration saw Russia as a threat, right? Definitely not the threat that it was during the Cold War, for instance, but a threat to U.S. interests nonetheless, right? Trump doesn't send the same signal, right? And so for its allies in Europe, that is worrisome, right? It's not just the Ukraine, but the kind of deterrence politics, no, that has been at the forefront of, shall we say, of peace, no, in Europe for since the end of the Cold War, no, now becomes less clear, right? And the transatlantic alliance that has been at the a foundational element of that deterrence strategy, no, is no longer as clear as it was, no, during the same period. Okay, so with that, everything is in flux. No? So it's a dream world for somebody like me looking at because there's so much to analyze, there's so much to actually look at, no. But for anybody who's invested in all of these things, it's a scary situation.
And for us ordinary people, it's scary because as it is, we're dealing with inflation. And with all of this happening, then for us, it seems like the threat of inflation will become even worse. And not to mention, of course, the more important issue of peace.
Right, yeah. It's, a large part of it is what you mentioned before. It's the uncertainty over the next few months, right? Stable economic relations has always been based on predictability, right? And with the geopolitical situation in such a turmoil, you're not really too sure about how economic planners, no, are looking at how they're going to be responding, what kinds of strategies they're going to put into place, no, or for that matter, thinking about who are we going to be trading with.
Yeah,
right?
well, so now not just trading with Philippines as a matter of strategy. How should we be aligning ourselves? Because under this current administration, we did have more EDCA sites.
Right.
Does that cause more risk to us as a nation since the United States is part of this conflict now with Iran and Israel?
Part of the calculation that U.S. allies in this region have been making, no, is the extent to which you can really rely on the United States to come in, right, and support support its allies in the face of perceived challenges, no, from the way that China is behaving to basically reshape regional relations, right? So we're now facing that situation. We've invested in our alliance with the United States, and that's what EDCA was all about. And the perception was that, or at least the argument was that, a change from the Biden administration to the Trump administration would not significantly change the nature of the relationship between the Philippines and the United States. that might be the case, but the issue really is to what extent can we say that the United States is committed to this region, especially since it's now distracted, if you will, by events that are actually going on more directly in the Middle East, no, and more indirectly things that are going on in the Ukraine.
Yeah. Well, the word or the term World War III has been brought up as well. Is this, do you think, a real risk to happen? Do you think, or years from now, do you see that this is something that might emerge out of the conflict in the Middle East?
We'd like to think that more rational heads will actually be able to prevent that from happening, right? Are we heading in that direction? I don't think so yet, right? But again, the kind of situation that we're facing right now could take a turn for the worst. And so, like I said, diplomacy should be the direction that we're heading in right now to make sure that all of these conflicts will not lead to World War III.
Well, we certainly hope so. But thank you so much, Professor Herman. I hope that we can have you back here again, especially as this conflict unfolds. I hope that the truce will really hold.
Thank you, Karen, for inviting me here.
The discussion on the economic costs of the Iran-Israel conflict will continue when At the Forefront returns after a short break. Welcome back at the Forefront. Joining us this morning is the Chief Economist of RCBC, Mike Ricafort. Good morning, Mike.
Hi, good morning, Attorney Karen and to your viewers. Nice to be back to Bilyonaryo.
Mike, there has been a truce or ceasefire that was announced yesterday. How have the markets responded to this news?
Well, positively, it was a pleasant surprise, Karen. It was like yesterday morning when U.S. President Trump announced that tentative ceasefire between Israel and Iran. So finally, it went through effective midnight New York time. So, oil suddenly went down to $65 per barrel. That erased practically all the increase since the conflict started between Israel and Iran on June 13th, Friday the 13th. No more increase. It's back to where it started. So that's good news. Imagine, it came from as high as when it opened last Monday morning. It opened at $78.
Yeah.
And, it stabilized at around $72, $73, even since late last week, prior to the U.S. attacks on Iran's nuclear facility last Saturday, which was unexpected. But nonetheless, it goes to show that oil is it's the dynamics between demand and supply. They're still somewhat well supplied in terms of oil. But of course, we're not complacent about it. We're still on our toes because we don't know if there would be indeed supply disruption, especially at the Strait of Hormuz, which is controlled by Iran. So far, no disruptions yet. That narrow strait where practically 20% of the world's oil produced in the Middle East passes through. So we have to, it's still a wait and see mode on that. But so far, so good, no disruptions yet. The latest increase in crude oil in local fuel pump prices, it was staggered last Tuesday and another one by tomorrow, by Thursday. So we'll see if that there would be substantial rollback on it.
Okay, well, Mike, you mentioned that it halted the increase in fuel at the international market. So do you still see that the price per barrel might reach that $80 mark, which is what people were predicting?
Well, so far, Attorney Karen, so it appears to be that it's having difficulty breaching the 78 mark. Well, it's not the first time that we saw that peak near 78. The first time happened almost 2 weeks ago, Friday the 13th. Then shortly thereafter, oil spiked to, well, when trading resumed a few days after, it reached a high of a little less than $78. And it corrected lower to 71, 72. It stabilized there. Then suddenly, during the surprise U.S. attack on Iran's nuclear facility last Saturday, well, when the markets were closed, it was $73. Then it spiked to 78. Then suddenly it went down. And even before Trump announced the ceasefire, moments before that, there was some retaliation by Iran in reaction to that. The missile attacks on the biggest
Air
base
base,
of,
yeah,
there at Qatar.
in
It was
Qatar, yeah.
successfully intercepted. The price of oil from $73, it went down to as low as $68.
Oh, that's
Then
great, yeah.
yeah, that was the immediate reaction. And then moments after Trump announced the ceasefire between Israel and Iran, it went down. It plummeted further to $65 to $66. That has been the range yesterday, and now it's stabilized there at $65. So this is like the lowest in 2 weeks since June 11. So erased all the increase. So now the dollar.
Mike, when you're saying that this erased the increase in the last 2 weeks, then why are we still facing this hike? Like yesterday, there was an increase of about an average of 2.50, 2 pesos 50 for diesel. And then tomorrow, there's supposedly another increase. How does that work ba? Yung mga suppliers ba natin dito, they buy really on a weekly basis, or do they increase just based on the market rates regardless of whether they have an old supply or already a stock of fuel?
It's a combination of both, Atty. Karen, because market forces are primarily at play. Competition, big players, small players. So there are greater choices by our consumers. Meaning to say, if you notice, there are some small players that price much lower than the bigger players, and so on and so forth. But that's even bigger players they do compete. Some of them in some areas, especially in non-prime areas where, say, rent is lower, the taxes are lower, and the cost of operating also lower. So, it's market forces, regardless of, if you come to think of it, some of them their inventories may be much cheaper before the conflict started on June 13th. And, well, there may be some market players who hedge their positions as a matter of prudence. When there was a spike over the past 2 weeks, especially since June 13th. So some of the market players may have been caught with more expensive inventories and some with cheaper inventories. So the markets are free. They're free to do whatever they want. Competition being there, regardless of the cost, whether they make money or lose money on their inventories. And there you go. That's the beauty about it, of competition. They would adjust because this is the world price. This is the latest increase may already be a lagging indicator, so to speak, reflecting the time when it was when oil prices were still relatively higher at 70 levels, but now they're down to 65. So it's just a matter of time. Give it a few days, and there would be some rollback coming in. And also the peso exchange rate also appreciated lately. As of this morning, it's doing somewhere around 56.60 to 56.70 levels. That's the strongest for the peso in more than a week, and that already improved from as high as 57.655 last Monday, the intraday high. So that's also a function because our almost all of our oil, all of the country's oil requirements are imported, and they're settled and paid in US dollars. The thing is, the dollar peso prior to the conflict, shortly before June 11th, it closed at 55.885.
Yeah,
So
and it
it's still
held
below
at that
56.
rate for several weeks. So now, with the conflict, biglang tumaas. So are you projecting that the peso will strengthen with the current developments?
Well, yeah, it's now improving. The peso is appreciating. Imagine, Tony Karen, that's almost a peso better from 57.655 intraday high that we saw last Monday. when the markets priced in the effects of the latest U.S. attacks on the Iranian facility, because that was the fear escalation. There were talks of a possible, U.S. already being dragged into this war. It could lead to the risk that it could lead to a wider war. But so far they've handled it well calculated, in the sense that diplomacy has been the priority for many countries, including the biggest Gulf states, the likes of Saudi Arabia and the neighboring countries there. And they even, some of them even condemned the missile attacks that passed through the territorial space of Qatar. Its condemnation of the retaliation by Iran, and it's really the move towards diplomacy to prevent further escalation from happening. And there's so much at stake in the world. Even the big players around the world, like even the likes of China, they purchase a lot of oil from the Middle East, and including from Iran, and that's why they're all careful, because it's for the best interest of everybody, for diplomacy to prevail, rather than escalation of war. And that has been being priced by the markets. Suddenly Trump having this clout and really announce and force upon the ceasefire between Israel and Iran.
Mike,
yeah.
there were a lot of OFWs that also had to go home to the Philippines because of this conflict. Have you seen any effects on OFW remittances that arose because of this conflict?
Oh, definitely, Karen. I've been monitoring this for, especially, the Israel-Hamas war started October of 2023. That's nearly 3 years ago. And we have seen already some decline, some slight decline in remittances, say, from Israel. For obvious reasons, because now, there's disruption in their economies. Deployment has been kind of restricted, so to speak, and there's even repatriation for those who are willing to come back here in the Philippines. But some of them, with 30,000 Filipinos in Israel, some of them opted to stay, a large number, because of their livelihood. And there's that the missile attacks are being dealt with the Iron Dome, with the missile defense system, and so on. And but the thing is, there may be some slight decline also in remittances. Even tourism, they're one of their biggest businesses there in the Holy Land. Those are disrupted. No tourism yet. Airspace, practically no planes there. They evacuated the planes. The airspace are cleared because of it's very risky, the missile attacks between Iran and Israel. And now there's ceasefire, hopefully. We'll see how long will this take. But definitely, there's economic impact there. The employment of FWs and the remittance that they send to the country, to the Philippines, would be adversely affected, would be reduced. And no deployment, no new deployment. That's a policy now for safety purposes. And some FWs who are willing to come back because of the heightened alert level, definitely that's going to weigh on everything.
So that is affecting our economy. Mike, what do you see would be the impact of this conflict? If it's prolonged for another couple of months, what would the impact be for the Philippine economy?
Well, because the Philippines imports almost all of its oil, Attorney Karen. And our requirements the Philippines, it's like 500,000 barrels of oil per day. We already came up with a sensitivity analysis. So should there be, say, every $10 increase in oil would increase the import bill of the country by around $5 million per day. And in a given month, multiply that by 30, that's around $150 million per month. And in a given year, multiply that by 12, so that would be around $1.8 billion additional oil bill for the country. But so far, it's, oil is still low. That's not much of a problem yet, but of course we don't want to be complacent about it. We have to be on our toes. Would there be potential supply disruption? Would there be potential escalation? But we all know they're all working for a more diplomatic solution about it. And the balance of powers, trying to going forward. But
Yeah.
so far,
So,
oil has been low.
In a
It's,
few words, would you say that you're optimistic at least about a more diplomatic approach and that this conflict would be resolved very soon?
Yeah, Attorney Karen, the first confrontation between Iran and Israel happened April of last year. So this has been more than a year already, and it occurred like around July again of last year. And the new game changer now, for the first time since June 21, U.S. is dragged into this. So it's a direct confrontation, direct attack by the U.S. to Iran's nuclear facility, and there were reports that there was limited damage, limited impact, despite the earlier pronouncement of a significant damage on the nuclear facilities and capabilities of Iran. But the thing is, going forward, so we'll see. It's still wait and see how everything goes.
Okay, so
If
we're
this
still at the wait and see. Well, thank you so much, Mike Ricafort, and thank you for your time today. We hope to have you in the studio next time.
Yeah, sure, Attorney Karen. Thank you so much, and your viewers have a pleasant morning, everyone.
Thank you so much. In the shadow of missiles and diplomacy, the world now watches a fragile peace taking hold between two Middle East adversaries. While the guns have fallen silent for now, the deeper currents of power, policy, and economics continue to shift beneath the surface. In this moment of calm, the challenge is not only to rebuild stability, but to prepare for what history may yet unfold. Be timely informed, be insightful of the news. Always stay at the forefront. Join us again tomorrow for meaningful insights on issues that matter. This is Attorney Karen Jimeno. Thank you for spending your hour with us.